Carrie Dahlgren. I'm a research fellow in the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University. Today, I'm going to use some of my research experience to talk to you about designing and conducting ethical research. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about collaborative ethnography. Now, design ethnography is often significantly collaborative, which overall is a really great approach. But I want to raise a few complexities in this really short talk, just so we don't take the ethics of collaboration for granted. So first off, all ethnography is collaborative. We can only do research with the help of our research interlocutors. We rely on their willingness to share with us. Knowledge is produced together in the research process. And there's no way of escaping at least some sort of collaboration when we do ethnography. But when we talk about collaborative ethnography as its own genre, we're usually referring to a research method and also possibly an authorship process that's explicitly collaborative. It more significantly involves our research participants in the research conversation, and possibly in the analysis and the writing up of the research findings. This also involves an iterative process between the researcher and the research team and the people about whom the research is about. This method of collaborative ethnography is a slightly more recent development in the history of ethnography, particularly anthropology, which is the discipline that I come from and will be speaking about today. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but generally anthropology has become more and more collaborative with its research participants throughout its history. Even the words that we use to describe the people that are being studied show an important shift. More traditional terms like research subjects or research informants really show sort of non-collaborative labels. Now you're more likely to use the phrase interlocutors, as in people we're engaged in a conversation with, or research participants as active participants in the research itself. You might even see research participants become co-authors in collaboratively produced ethnographic texts. This shift towards viewing research participants as more active in the research, including in the writing up and representation of findings, is an attempt to kind of reconfigure some of the problematic power relationships that underpin all research, but are maybe especially problematic in anthropological research, which has historically been characterized by elite white males from elite European or North American institutions studying so-called others, or often indigenous people living in the global south. A lot of this earlier research was done in the era of colonialism, funded by colonial governments, and played a part in colonial projects. Further, this older anthropology really relied on this false idea that indigenous people's lives and their complexity could just be recorded and analyzed by the white anthropologist, characterized by what Trio has called the savage slot, which has historically characterized anthropology. In addition to this earlier disciplinary history, the discipline also underwent what is often termed the crisis of representation in the 1980s. This is generally connected to the work of James Clifford and George Marcus in their 1986 book, Writing Culture. And one of the many takeaways of this so-called crisis of representation was that ethnography and ethnographic writing should be more collaborative and participatory, and to recognize that research is not only more ethical this way, but also better when you take this into account. But as Margot Weiss has pointed out, collaboration has two definitions. First is, of course, this idea of united labor, working together, cooperation. But it also has a second connotation. That is, it's traitorous or treacherous cooperation with the enemy. Margot Weiss writes, "The Oxford English Dictionary's two definitions of collaboration coexist in anthropological practice, even as we've embraced the first to challenge the second. So even as we've embraced this cooperation, this working together, as a way to overcome the second issue, right? This treacherous, traitorous cooperation with the enemy." She's referring here, of course, to the use of anthropological knowledge in ethnography and the colonial project, but also how some of these power dynamics continue. And this intervention of hers also points out how collaboration isn't always simply an ethical good. There are circumstances in which we might want to approach collaboration more cautiously. Who are we collaborating with and why? Ethics is not at all one size fits all. It's not just about getting approval from your university ethics board. It's not about ticking boxes and getting consent forms signed. While we might have to do some of this formal process, actual ethics is about a constant evaluation of the potential benefits and harms, the purpose, the values, and the principles that guide our research. We must always and continually be reassessing the ethics of our research as it unfolds and consider potential unforeseen consequences. So just in order to contribute to helping you think through how you might want to design ethical research projects for yourselves, particularly collaborative ones, I want to raise some questions and ideas about the complexities of collaboration, using the example of my own research, part of which was with pro-coal lobbyists. Now, for my PhD, I was lucky to have 2 years to do ethnographic fieldwork. I first moved to a small coal mining town in Australia and conducted rather traditional participant observation there, within a small mining community. But after about a year, I felt I'd gained a pretty good understanding and sense of what life was like in that community, and I also kind of realized that I had other important questions that my experiences there raised, but which couldn't really be fully answered within that community. So I went looking for a second field site to spend the next year of my research. One of the key questions that I wanted to investigate was the broader debate about the future of coal. So in Australia, coal is enveloped in a complex kind of political and moral terrain and debate, which weighs coal's contribution to global climate change and its negative environmental effects against its importance to the economy and the strong national discourse of the value of mining. So I wanted to more fully investigate how this political terrain was shaped by looking at and researching those actively involved in shaping and making these discourses, which gave me two kind of obvious options. I could study the environmental movement, or I could study the pro-coal lobby. To a certain degree, the ethics might have been a bit more straightforward if I studied the environmental movement, but there were already a lot of social scientists doing this work, which is kind of understandable, right? One of the ways that we can be collaborative ethnographers, while also being true to our own ethics, is to study those who we morally and ethically agree with, or at least those whose perspective we feel deserves to be elevated. But my own ethical positioning was that I take climate change, of course, very seriously, and that in order to successfully address the climate crisis, I think we need to understand the perspective of those who feel differently than us. We need to understand how perspectives and discourses that we don't agree with are reproduced if we're going to be able to effectively argue against them. And to me, this is where ethnography can really contribute to the climate crisis. So I went to work and was lucky and managed to secure access to research within a small group of pro-coal lobbyists in another Australian mining town. From the beginning, I was very adamant that I wouldn't give the lobbyists any access or ability to influence what I wrote. I would not allow them to read drafts or give comments. I would not share preliminary findings. They would be allowed to read anything at the same time as it was publicly available. This is kind of the opposite of collaborative ethnography, at least in the sense of authorship. I intentionally didn't want to give them any control over how they were represented. My starting point had to be one of maintaining my academic integrity and control over my research, partly because lobbyists are known to attempt to use academic research to serve their own cause, and such I had to protect my own research from any attempts at manipulation. I also needed to be sure that this rather litigious group wouldn't try to stop the publication of my writing, interrupting my PhD and potentially my academic career. So in this case, collaborative authorship or analysis wasn't something that was really ethical in these circumstances. The power dynamics were such that even though I was the researcher representing them, the organization I was writing about was actually more powerful than I was. So having set these initial protections, my research did end up becoming more collaborative, just in a slightly different sense. Over time, this group of people were not only research participants, but became my colleagues, my friends. As I participated in the group's work, we went to dinners, drinks, I met their families. Over a year spent working together, we became understandably very close. Of course, this raises other dilemmas. This meant that I was trying to understand the motivations of these people, my friends and research participants, in order to counteract their supposed goals, right? My attempt to understand their lives and motivations was simultaneously driven by an attempt to counter them, to argue against them, to undercut them. So one of the ways that I felt comfortable with this ethical position was just by being open about it. I had lots of long talks and in-depth discussions with my lobbyists and friends where I expressed my views on climate change and the environmental damage of mining. So I've sometimes been critiqued for referring to my participants as friends, but this is an intentional attempt to humanize them. And to me, it more accurately describes the relationship we had than just research informant. Because in order to maintain my access, my rapport, and my closeness to these coal lobbyists, while also being able to openly disagree with them, it was really important that I joined what Hans Steinmuller calls a community of complicity. This phrase describes a group of people who share a mutual understanding of the boundaries between sort of a public discourse and its lived ambiguities. In essence, our shared participation and understanding of the work of the lobby meant that we could recognize that we didn't always mean what we said, right? That reality is always more complicated. And so a mutual sense of understanding of the ambiguities and the messiness of real life, which made it different from idealized discourses or ideologies, was important for me to develop a rapport with my informants, but also helped me understand how the coal industry was a powerful motivator for the lobbyists. In essence, I had to become complicit in order to understand how the coal industry gained moral weight for the pro-coal lobbyists. So complicity is another interesting aspect of collaboration here. Resonating more with collaboration in the treasonous sense, complicity might just be a necessary part of ethnographic research. The need to develop rapport with research participants is clearly necessary. We need to be trusted and respected in order for people to open up to us. But when does rapport become more ethically problematic? George Marcus calls complicity rapport's evil twin, or more ethically troubling shadow, and that it is a morally ambiguous condition that's foundational, though, to the intimacies of fieldwork. But this is also productive, because it shows that unexpected affinities, what he says more cognitive than ethical, develop between the researcher and their informants. For me, those unexpected affinities didn't discount my concerns about climate change or environmental damage, but quite the contrary. The empathy that I developed with my research informants revealed that by paying attention to our mutual understandings and shared concerns could lead to a more mutual position that highlighted the inconsistencies, gaps, and opportunities for resisting the pro-coal lobbyist discourse. So this might not seem immediately relevant to your own research project. Some circumstances don't raise as obvious ethical conundrums, but that doesn't mean there aren't ethical issues to consider. And to a certain degree, sometimes projects that don't seem to have such intense ethical dilemmas can be a bit more dangerous because we're not on the lookout for them. But any knowledge we produce has consequences, or hopefully it does, because it means we have impact. But we need to think beforehand what we want that impact to be, and how we can design a research project that gets us there. There's no easy solution. Every project requires its own ethical dilemmas and its own ethical solutions, and it also needs to be constantly reevaluated as the ethics and the project develop. So I hope this has given you some things to think about as you design your own research projects. And thank you for listening.